Sure. Thanks, Hiram. Just three very quick points. The first is, let me just explain that I wrote this, I read the detective novels at night because I have a very strong superego, and I'm supposed to be doing global commerce, and I have a dean, and I just thought that I should read my detective novels at night and do my serious work during the day. And the problem was that as I began to read the historical work during the day, I realized how formulaic we were, how conventional we were, and how the conventions which I saw in the evening I could kind of construct all these different conventions. The same way that Simon was looking at aesthetic patterns, you could see all these conventional patterns for historical work and classify them in that way. It had a terrible effect on me. And so the first was this kind of sense that it was a disappointment in our own formulaic sense as historians. I think that Chris addresses the same problem, but we do it in two very different ways. Chris spoke about the preparatory acts, the need to understand prior to get to work, to have the various iterations of thinking about the psyche of Nat Turner in all sorts of fashion. We actually, in a sidebar between one of the sessions, we talked about all the things that historians need to do, from boots on their shoes, from mud on their boots, to knowing the place, to knowing the psyches, to knowing the cultures in various ways. I'm actually take a very different approach. I think of it ex post. I think what we do when we deal with context and text and formulas of all kinds of conventions is that we simply are going to fail. And there's a question of this constant failure, which occurred at the last two novels that I described, is a constant failure which I think leads to the rewriting of a different kind of history. So if I had to think about how to rename the conference ex post, because I'm much better at ex post than I am ex ante, I would say it's law and art and history and ellipsis. And somewhere in that ellipsis is Verstehen, it's intuition, it's skin climbing, it's all that stuff that we get after we fail in the various ways that we fail. So.
Thank you very much. The floor is open. I think we can also reflect on the theme and methodology as the Yoram invites us to do of this conference. Or not?
I'm going to go back to the paper for a second. Just to the endings, right, where you say the last novel in each series, fails to do what it was supposed to do throughout the series. And I'm wondering, I guess, whether what is finally preserved in that failure is the idea of truth, which is somehow more foundational than text and context both, right? Which seems to me a similar ideology in both texts, right? And the notion that truth could be separated from text, from context, or from other historical methods, and be discussed in itself as something which remains even though we failed, right? So I'm curious about that notion.
You'd like to collect questions?
I'll take a couple. Yeah.
I have just a short question. Would you consider the film footnote in your presentation? Because there also we have the text, very strong element of text. We have context, and we also have it falling apart. Could you consider it in your presentation as well?
So in terms of the truth, yes, I mean, that's what I think the two prophetic figures are actually calling for. So the Sibyl, as I try to say, the Sibyl is really the Sibyl of the fourth Eclogue of Virgil. That's what is suggested by the Sarah Caldwell novel. And that's a figure who is a figure identified with truth and points in two different directions, one towards the netherworld, traditionally in Virgil, and the other towards a possible utopian future, stuff like this. And that's a truth figure. And the Gemula is a truth figure. And there's a truth that comes out of both of them, which is larger, which is that there's a whole kind of irrational world that needs to be understood, which is a truth that is understood by Hilary Tamar at the end of the Sarah Caldwell novel, and that there's a much larger story to what truth is at the end of the Bachagor. The truth might also be reflecting on the hiding of certain facts and the smoothing of certain facts to obtain sort of a larger truth. So I think truth does emerge. It's just that truth takes on all these different characteristics. In terms of footnote, yes, well, I'm. That is sort of a. It's very hard to work. I was thinking about this as we had the paper on the flat on the DRA. I thought this is such a hard business to do the kind of analysis on film. It's much harder, I think, to do analysis of film in that way than it is for text, because you have less material to work with. But clearly, that's the difference between a textual father and a contextual son. But mostly it's a story about a relationship, which of course gets back to I think Yoram's comment that the relational and the human in some ways is the most interesting feature, not either text nor context.
Anybody?
So I love murder mysteries, I have to confess. And I don't know yet whether there is a genre of murder mystery, though I suspect there must be postmodern murder mysteries in which, in the end, you don't know who did it. Do they sell? But I think this is a very important piece because it goes back to Anat's question about truth. I mean, the hook is that you will find something out in the end. You will know the fact of the matter. This is some elemental, emotional wish and desire that gets satisfied in the fictional world, though it never gets satisfied in real life. And that really reminds me in a way of not just Anat's comment now, but what you spoke about in the very beginning, about this aspiration, sort of Plato's Minos, right? The law aspires toward the truth. It gestures towards the truth. It needs to keep some concept of the fact of the matter out there, right? Even if it never reaches it. So I wonder whether there's something more there about the detective novel. And maybe that's not a question, but kind of just a generalized question, and not a question to use to.
Partly the truth, but also the resolution of the trauma. Because there's been a terrible violent act, and you have to resolve it in some fashion or another. So the truth is in part the truth because we need to have an epistemological end to the game, but we also need to have a way to deal with the violence, which is why they're all about law in a sense, because law functions in much that fashion. It's legal not because it involves legal process, it's legal because it involves the resolution to the trauma of the violent social act.
So I think that's a fascinating observation, but it strikes me that in a lot of detective fiction, the trauma is rendered in a way that makes it seem almost, I wouldn't go so far as to say innocuous, but it's certainly tidied up in such a way that the traumatic aspect of it certainly isn't highlighted. What's highlighted instead is the joy in the puzzle of, or in the process of resolving the puzzle, so that the murder is said as a problem more than as a horrific event that everyone's trying to grapple with. And it strikes me that to that extent, it's not surprising that lawyers or legal historians would be set as detectives, because they take the same sort of pleasure in solving legal puzzles as they might in the puzzle that's said as the one that can be generically undertaken and resolved in the course of the mystery.
So I think that and yes, I mean I think you might divide the genre into two types. You might into little gray cell genre, right? So that's an analytic question of trying to resolve that in this kind of mathematical or calculative fashion. But there's also, there is also a genre which deals with the effect on community. So I'm sort of shifting from books to film. So Broadchurch is an example where there's been a murder of a child. If you've seen the BBC Broadchurch, and it's really about how the community deals with the murder of that child, or the Danish Forbedelsen, which I think I'm pronouncing it incorrectly. What? How's that go?
Yeah.
Thank you. You heard it here first. And that focuses largely on the on the victim's family. So that you spend a great deal of time with the victim's family. It's like a victim impact statement in the form of a murder mystery. So, so I think there are, I think it's doing both. But I think you're right. There is this little gray cell side.
Okay, just this is a contextualist comment. I think it was in AC's joint article with Lawrence Friedman. There was an argument about the detective novel as being a literary form related to American capitalism.
No, it actually has to do with Susan's question, which I don't think there is a detective story where there's no.
I wrote one once and it got rejected.
So.
So you could still make money by suing them for rejecting it.
So many law professors write detective stories. It's actually interesting. And there is a truth, but there is a shift in the content of the truth. So if the classic and hard-boiled detective stories were rational and they had a reason there that we could find, jealousy, money, whatever, the new detective stories sometimes have no rationality in them. So truth is that there is no meaning for the murder. And this is why we actually have to use tools like CSI. Like CSI is the modern detective stories, right? Well, all we have is fibers and blood. Otherwise, we would never find, because Sherlock would never find them because they have no, and neither, what's his name, Hillary
Tamar.
Because text and context wouldn't help. Only science is our savior.
Anyway, so the comment is contextualize your story a bit. It's a very nice, very interesting methodological approach to take these two totally unrelated series of novels and kind of compare them. It would be interesting to reflect a bit about the context in which they were produced, not the context, the Israeli cultural context, maybe the English one, but the history of literature or the history of this subgenre called detective stories, which is a very kind of Anglo-American thing, and kind of, you have a bit of it at the beginning when you talk about Israel, Romy Shani, I think, talking about
Right.
Yeah, but so kind of one of the things that I think was a bit missing generally, kind of embed our very kind of wide corpus of papers in another type of history, the history of literature, which is.
Well, what's interesting about Jagur is if you close your eyes, she reads like Josephine Tay or Ruth Rendell, except that it's always an ideological murder.
That's an Israeli thing.
Which is an Israeli thing, but the aesthetic is English. It's fascinating.
I want to learn how to read with my eyes closed. So this is not really a question, but it follows on some of the discussion. And I just want to resist the idea that the law is boring.
The more boring it is, the more interesting.
No, I don't think that either. But my sense of what drives people to do history with law or literature with history with law is that they're driven to know things, which is just part of the way we are. I mean, this is my personal experience of it is there's something originary about curiosity, and the stakes of each of these different things work on different people differently, but the stakes in law are almost always incredibly urgent, and so I just find the trope that's come about the boredom of law just bizarre. Anyway.
Can I say?
Yes.
Is that fair? But I just want to say, right, there's a popular notion of boredom, which you're reacting to, I think. And I wasn't at all trying to raise that. I was talking about a rational aesthetic as something that has some formal features we could talk about seriously. I'm not talking about boring subject matter or about law being less complex or less caring about people or anything. I mean, I don't mean that. I mean that there are formal features which are really worth, which has a history, which have a history, right, which is pretty recent, and which should be probably investigated, right?
You watch juries when they...
You can jump whenever you want.
I know. It's doing fine.
I also want to add my own little hobby horse. I agree absolutely with what Anat just said, and I just wanted to add my own hobby horse, which was not. This is not everyone here talk this way, but it's come up recently in several things, in which, again, law seems to be the center, the object, what we are really interested in, and then we add some things that can maybe help us understand the law, because that is what is important, that is what is at stake. And I don't think that that is the case for all of us here. And I don't think also that it is the thing that is urgent necessarily, or the thing that is important necessarily, or the thing that counts necessarily. Even in the real world, be that what that may be. So I felt that I had to put that out there.
No, I had the opposite feeling in the conference, that I resist, that it's always, the law is out there, but we need literature and we need history in order to understand it better, to complexify it, and so forth. And so most of the questions were aimed to bring back the law as its own discipline that it's a threesome here. It's not just an object that we turn to history or literature in order to understand better, or to. So it's so. I felt the opposite, that law was played down as a way, because I think about interdisciplinary work not as one-dimensional or even end-end towards law, but that law has its own way of reflecting back on them and bring its own disciplinary tools. So that's...
No, I agree completely. I mean, that is exactly my point, in that... not that law was the object of the study, but right, that, all these things need to come and help poor law, because, so I actually agree with your formulation as well.
Bernadette Myler has a phrase for all of this. She calls it the love triangle.
Right, it's between law, art, and history. So and in love triangle, I'm not so sure in the menage a trois anyone is more significant than anyone else. It's part of the trois business. So anyway, that's how she phrases it.
It's a good thought.
Yeah, menage a trois is a good place to start, actually, but thank you very much.
You see,